The first warning came not as a scream of alarms, but as a profound and unsettling silence. On the lunar facility known as Farside Station, the constant low-level hum of the communications array was the background music of life. It was the thread that connected 312 souls to Earth, a blue and white marble hanging eternally in the black velvet sky above them. When that hum died, it was as if the universe itself had held its breath. Dr. Aris Thorne, the station's lead geologist, felt it before he heard it. He looked up from his holographic display of lunar core samples, a frown creasing his weathered face. The soft chatter of the common area, where a few off-duty crew were nursing synthetic coffee, had also dimmed, replaced by a nervous energy. "Communications down?" a young engineer named Sato asked from his console, his voice tight. "It's not a glitch. The dish is pointed right at Earth. We're getting nothing. Just static." Captain Eva Rostova, a woman with eyes the color of the deep ocean and a voice hardened by 20 years of service, was already striding onto the command deck. "Check the backup array. Isolate the problem." "Backup is also down, Captain," Sato reported, his fingers flying across his screen. "It's not a hardware failure. It's like the entire spectrum went dead. Something's jamming everything." A tense hush fell over the command deck. The isolation was instant and absolute. They were a tiny bubble of light and air on a desolate world, now cut off from the rest of humanity. Before anyone could voice the fear that was coiling in their stomachs, the proximity alerts screamed to life. "Captain!" The sensor operator, a woman named Chen, pointed a trembling finger at the main screen. "Multiple contacts. They just appeared. No approach vector, no acceleration curve. They're just there." On the screen, half a dozen shapes resolved from the darkness. They were not human designs. They were jagged, asymmetrical things, like splinters of obsidian, their surfaces absorbing the faint starlight. They hung in a loose formation less than 100 kilometers from the facility. There was no hail, no demand for surrender, no declaration of war. The universe, which had fallen silent, simply erupted in light. A beam of searing actinic energy, white-hot and impossibly bright, lanced out from the lead ship. It struck the lunar surface a kilometer from the facility, and the ground itself seemed to heave. A plume of vaporized rock and regolith shot skyward, a silent, violent geyser in the airless void. The first impact was a warning shot. The second was not. The beam walked across the surface, directly towards Farside Station. Captain Rostova didn't hesitate. "All hands, emergency evac to the deep shelters, now! Move!" The next few seconds were a blur of controlled panic. Scientists, engineers, and medical staff scrambled, their training kicking in as they raced for the reinforced bunkers carved deep into the lunar rock. Aris found himself half carrying a young botanist who had frozen in the corridor, her eyes wide with terror. He shoved her through the heavy airlock door of Shelter 7 just as the world turned to fire. The facility wasn't just hit, it was erased. The alien weapons didn't rely on explosive force alone. They unleashed a kind of energy that caused matter to unravel at a molecular level. The hydroponic gardens, the laboratories, the living quarters, the command deck where Eva Rostova stood until the last possible second, watching the enemy ships on a flickering screen. It all dissolved into a glowing mist of constituent atoms. Deep beneath the surface, in the reinforced shelters, the survivors were thrown against the walls as the shockwave, transmitted through the bedrock, rattled their sanctuary. The lights flickered, the emergency systems kicked in, and then there was silence again. A different kind of silence. The silence of the tomb. In Shelter 7, Aris Thorne picked himself up off the floor. Dust tickled his throat. He looked around at the 24 terrified faces illuminated by the red emergency lights. They were scientists, technicians, a cook. They were not soldiers. "The captain?" a voice whispered into the gloom. Aris had no answer. He only knew that the world they had known, the safe, civilized world connected to the blue marble in the sky, was gone. They were now simply survivors in a hole on a dead world, while unknown enemies prowled the darkness above. For 3 agonizing days, they waited. The enemy ships maintained their orbit, their dark shapes occasionally blotting out the stars on the facility's external camera feeds, which miraculously still worked. The aliens didn't land. They didn't send a probe. They simply sat there, a silent, overwhelming presence, as if waiting for the vermin to die in their hole. On the 3rd day, the communications array, buried deep and shielded from the initial attack, sputtered to life. It wasn't a clean signal, just a narrow, desperate burst of data. It was from Earth. The news was fragmentary and horrifying. The attack on the moon had been just the opening move. Simultaneously, the alien ships had appeared in orbit around Earth. Major cities had been struck. Communications were down across entire continents. The first desperate and largely futile attempts by Earth's combined defense forces to fight back had been swatted aside with contemptuous ease. Humanity was reeling, stunned by a blow from an unknown enemy. The message ended with a single, stark directive from the remnants of the Earth Defense Command, buried deep in a bunker somewhere in the Rockies. All off-world assets are to be considered autonomous. Your objective? Survival. Our objective? Survival. Long-range quantum relays are now the only secure communication. We will rebuild. We will find a way. We are human. The message offered no hope of rescue. It offered only a grim reality. They were on their own. In Shelter 7, the mood was one of stunned despair. They were scientists, not warriors. Their greatest weapons were rock hammers and sampling tools. But Eris Thorne was a geologist. And a geologist understands one thing above all others: pressure. He gathered the survivors in the main shelter, his face illuminated by a portable lantern. "We have a choice," he said, his voice calm, steady. "We can sit here and wait for them to forget about us, or to come back and finish the job. Or we can do what humans have always done. We can look at what we have and we can build something." "Build what?" Sato, the young engineer who had also made it to a shelter, asked bitterly. "We have lab equipment and some emergency rations. They have ships that can wipe out cities." "They have ships that can wipe out cities," Eris agreed. "Ships that have to obey the laws of physics, ships that are made of matter. And we have the largest, most stable, and most thoroughly studied piece of matter in the solar system right outside our door." He gestured upwards. "We have the moon." It was a spark in the darkness, an idea so audacious, so wildly improbable that it was almost laughable. But it was an idea, and in the face of annihilation, an idea was the most precious thing they had. The plan, when it began to take shape over the following weeks, was absurd in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. They wouldn't try to build a ship to fight the aliens. They wouldn't try to launch missiles from the surface. Those would be detected and destroyed in seconds. Instead, they would use the moon itself as a weapon. Eris, with the help of the facility's geologists and engineers, identified a series of deep geological faults running through the lunar crust near their position. They were remnants of ancient impacts, stress lines in the planetary body. Their idea was to trigger a chain reaction along these faults, using a series of precisely placed, ultra-high-yield nuclear devices. The facility, as a scientific outpost, had no nuclear weapons, but it did have something almost as potent: the nuclear reactors that powered the base. 3 compact, high-output fission reactors, each one a miniature sun in a box. The plan, codenamed Hammerfall, was to transport the reactors along with every scrap of fissionable material from the base's research labs to the deepest point of the primary fault line, a chasm known as the Rupes Recta, hundreds of kilometers away. There they would be reconfigured into improvised geological demolition charges. If detonated in the correct sequence, the resulting seismic shock would be catastrophic. It would be like hitting a cracked bell with a sledgehammer. The moon wouldn't shatter, but a massive section of its crust, millions of tons of rock traveling at thousands of kilometers per hour, would be launched into space, directly into the path of the orbiting alien fleet. It was a 1 in a million shot, It required pinpoint accuracy, perfect timing, and the courage to walk onto a lifeless, airless plane carrying the very core of their own power source, while an enemy fleet lurked in the sky above. The work began in secret, in the silent, crushing dark of the lunar night. They jury-rigged the base's remaining rovers, stripped them of anything non-essential to maximize their cargo capacity. They built sleds out of titanium plating to drag the decommissioned reactors. They became moles, ghosts, working only in the long, 2-week-long lunar night, when the alien ships, on the far side of the moon, couldn't see them. Dr. Alara Vance, the station's chief engineer, a woman with grease permanently embedded under her fingernails and a mind like a steel trap, was the architect of the technical side of the plan. She worked with Sato and a handful of others, carefully extracting the reactor cores, a process so dangerous it was normally done by robots in clean rooms. Here, they did it by hand, in bulky EVA suits, their breaths loud in their helmets as they handled pure, deadly radioactivity. "This is insane, Alara," Sato muttered one night, as they carefully guided the glowing core of Reactor 2 onto a reinforced sled. His radiation badge was already beeping a frantic warning. "Probably," Alara replied, her voice calm over the comms. "But it's our kind of insane. It's human insane. No other species would be stupid enough to try this. That's our advantage." The journey to the Rupes Recta was a nightmare. The terrain was treacherous, a landscape of ancient, razor-sharp lava flows and deep, shadow-filled craters. The rovers, overloaded and struggling, broke down constantly. They had to stop and make repairs in the open, under the pinprick light of distant stars, always aware that at any moment one of the alien ships could crest the lunar horizon and see them. Eris drove the lead rover, his eyes fixed on the terrain ahead, his mind on the woman he'd left behind on Earth, on the grandson he'd never met. He thought about the blue marble, now a symbol of everything they were fighting for. He wasn't a soldier, but he understood geology. He understood that the greatest forces on a planet were not the ones on the surface, but the ones building deep within. They were going to unleash that force. On the 5th night of the trek, they saw one of the alien ships. It wasn't in orbit, it was descending. It was a massive, splinter-like shape, easily a kilometer long, and it was heading for a landing site less than 50 kilometers from their position. They killed all power, huddled in their rovers, and waited in the freezing dark. The ground trembled slightly as the alien vessel touched down. They could only imagine what horrors it carried. "They're establishing a ground presence," Sato whispered over a short-range, low-power comm channel. "Why?" "Maybe they're looking for survivors," Ilara theorized, her voice grim. "Maybe they want to study us. Either way, it just upped the stakes. If they find our tracks, our shelters, they'll know we're here." The landing added a new layer of terror. Every moment they were outside now, they risked being spotted by a patrol, by a sensor sweep. They moved even slower, even more carefully, using the terrain for cover, traveling only in the deepest shadows. Finally, after 10 grueling days, they reached the Rupes Recta. It was a staggering sight, a sheer cliff face, a scar in the moon's surface that stretched for over 100 kilometers, rising nearly 300 meters from the plain below. At its base was the fault line, a deep, dark crack in the lunar crust. The work of placing the charges was the most dangerous yet. They had to descend into the chasm, using rappelling gear, carefully lowering the reactor cores and the packs of fissionable material into the precise locations Ilara and Eris had calculated. They worked in teams of 2, one lowering, one guiding the deadly cargo into the darkness. Eris was in the chasm, guiding a reactor core into its final resting place, when he heard a sharp crackle in his helmet. It wasn't a voice, it was a sensor alert. He looked up at the sky, a narrow ribbon of blackness above him, and saw it. A small, darting shape, moving against the stars. An alien craft, a patrol drone, sweeping low over the Rupes Recta. It was close. too close. He froze, pressing himself against the chasm wall, his suit's surface the same dull gray as the rock. The drone hovered for what felt like an eternity, its sensors playing over the landscape. Then, slowly, it moved on, disappearing over the horizon. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It hadn't seen them. The chasm had hidden them. The last charge was placed. They retreated to a safe distance, a small crater they'd designated as the observation post. They had rigged a detonation sequence, a timed signal that would set off the charges in a precise, cascading order. All they had to do now was wait for the alien fleet to be in the perfect position. For 2 more days, they waited. They watched as more alien ships landed on the plain below. They saw the construction of a strange, crystalline structure, a base of their own. The aliens were making themselves at home on the moon, confident in their victory. On the second day, Sato, who had been monitoring the aliens' orbital patterns, gave the word. "They're in the window. The main fleet is in a geostationary orbit above this hemisphere. If we fire now, the debris field will pass right through them." The moment of truth had arrived. They had no complex launch controls, no firing keys. Ilara had built a simple detonator, a modified power cell connected to a timing circuit. Aris held it in his gloved hand. It was a crude, ugly thing, but it held the power of a god. He looked at the others. They were haggard, exhausted, their faces pale behind their helmet visors. Scientists, engineers, a cook. They had walked into hell and built a bomb out of their own home. "For Earth," he said simply. He pressed the button. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The lunar surface remained silent and still. Then, Aris felt it. A faint vibration through the soles of his boots. It grew, steadily, into a deep, bone-jarring rumble. The ground beneath them began to shake, not violently, but with a profound planetary power. They looked towards the Rupes Recta. At first there was nothing. Then a crack of light appeared at the base of the cliff, a brilliant white-orange glow from the vaporizing rock deep below. It spread, spider-webbing along the fault line. The cliff face itself began to tremble, then to move. It didn't crumble, it lifted. A massive section of the lunar crust, miles wide and hundreds of meters thick, was being pushed upwards from below by the unimaginable force of the simultaneous detonations. It was a silent, awesome spectacle. A continent of rock lifted by the hand of humanity. For a few seconds it hung there, defying gravity. Then the secondary charges fired, tilting the massive slab. It began to move, not falling back to the moon, but sliding into the void, propelled by the force of the eruption. It was a slow-moving avalanche in the 0G of space, a cloud of debris that grew and grew, a shotgun blast of lunar rock and dust, millions of tons of it, accelerating as it left the moon's weak gravity well, heading directly for the alien fleet in orbit above. From their observation post, the survivors watched. At first, the debris cloud was invisible against the blackness. Then they saw the first impact. A flash of light, silent and brilliant, as a house-sized boulder struck the lead alien ship. Then another, and another. The sky above them began to sparkle with 1,000 tiny, deadly lights. The alien ships designed for energy combat, for sleek, precise warfare, had no defense against a kinetic storm of this magnitude. Their shields, if they had them, were overwhelmed in seconds. Their hulls were punctured, shattered, torn apart by the relentless barrage. One ship tried to maneuver, to flee, but it was too slow. A massive chunk of rock, a small mountain, plowed directly through its center, and the ship simply ceased to exist, dissolving into a cloud of glittering debris. Another, the huge command ship, was struck multiple times. It listed, then began a slow, graceful tumble, its lights flickering and dying, before plunging out of control towards the lunar surface. On the ground, the alien base was not spared. The rain of debris was global. Large fragments thrown clear of the moon began to fall back, creating a secondary bombardment. The crystalline structure was obliterated in a series of impacts, its pieces scattered across the plain. The survivors watched in stunned silence. The entire spectacle was silent, a terrifyingly beautiful light show of destruction. It lasted for nearly an hour, and when it was over, the sky above the moon was clear. The alien fleet was gone. Nothing remained but a slowly dispersing cloud of debris, a new, faint ring of rock and dust circling their world. Silence returned to the lunar surface, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of victory. Eris let the detonator slip from his fingers. He turned to look at the others. Ilara had tears streaming down her face, mixing with the grime. Sato was just staring, his mouth open. The cook, a man named Ben, was laughing, a hysterical, joyous sound over the comms. They had done it. A handful of scientists, armed with nothing but their wits and the very ground beneath their feet, had destroyed an invading armada. They had turned their tomb into a weapon. Days later, after the dust had settled, they managed to re-establish a stronger link with Earth. The news was slow, fragmented, but hopeful. The attack on Earth had stalled. With their command and control ships destroyed, the remaining alien forces in orbit around Earth had become disorganized. Humanity's own scattered defenses, their fighter jets and ground-based missiles, were starting to have an effect. The alien invasion, so confident and overwhelming just weeks ago, was faltering. The message from Earth Defense Command was different this time. It was no longer a grim directive for survival. It was a question, filled with awe and disbelief. Farside Station, we are reading a massive geological event on the lunar near side. Our sensors indicate an unnatural seismic signature. What happened up there? Eris looked at Ilara, at Sato, at the ragged group of survivors gathered around the makeshift comms unit. They were no longer just scientists. They were the people who had struck back. They were the spark that had ignited a war. He keyed the microphone, a small smile playing on his lips for the first time in weeks. He thought of the blue marble, of the billions of people down there who would never know their names, who would never know the full story of what had happened on this desolate, lifeless world. He thought of the aliens, who had looked at a peaceful scientific outpost and seen easy prey. They had looked at the moon and seen a lifeless rock. They had made a critical error. They had underestimated what lives on a lifeless rock. They had forgotten the first, most important rule of survival in a cold, hard universe. Never hit a geologist with a rock. Earth Defense Command, Eris transmitted, his voice steady and clear across the quarter-million-mile void. This is Farside Station. We just wanted to remind the universe that we're still here, and we're not going anywhere. He paused, looking out the small viewport at the battered, scarred, but still beautiful lunar landscape. Then he added, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable pride. Tell them we're just getting started.